Well, throughout Epic's short history, we're just a little over 5 years old, there have been these moments that have presented themselves, and they've always come at a price, right? To say, hey, will more of us jump into what God is doing in this season? And friends, September 18th, we have 6 weeks from today, a great opportunity just to say, God, we want to be a part, we want to sow seed, we want to be used, and whatever it is that you want to do here. It's this beautiful thing that's happened in the 5+ years, but it's never happened by accident, and it's never happened because of the potential that existed within the Epic Church community. It's always happened because men and women, just like me and you, have responded to God's call to lean in and to maximize the opportunity that He presents before us. And so thrilled about this fall, and I just want to say, jump on a team, jump on in, join a team. This is crazy, but the people that we just celebrated who created our website, volunteers, okay? So we're not going to ask you, nor are they going to ask me to spend 80 to 100 hours like some volunteers are spending. But could you join one of these teams? As we go to 3 services, we need to have deeper rosters on every single one of our team. Epic Kids, Epic Students, the band. They're going to be here a lot longer on Sundays, which means we'd love to be able to give them a break and not have them to have to serve. Production team, hospitality team, on and on and on. And so we're just going to continue to hit that. 9 o'clock, 10:30, and noon. And, I kind of know who's going to the 9 o'clock, probably the 9:30 people. But at the 11 o'clock, are you guys doing more 10:30 or noon? How many people leaning towards the 10:30? Noon? Hey, if you get here after 11 right now, there is no way 10:30 is going to work for you, all right? But come at 11:15, just like you do now, 45 minutes in the lobby, coffee time, we'll be ready for you. So we're thrilled about this, and just know that as you jump in, basically what I'd love for you to do is to consider, not every single Sunday, but most Sundays, like attend one of the 3 hours and try to serve at one of the other ones. And so let us know by filling that card out. Right now it's just a volunteer thing, but, we'll have to come to you if we don't get enough help, and just call you out by name. We're in this Form series, and we continue that series today. We're taking it all the way through the end of this month. And here's the question I want to just lead off with this morning. Have you noticed the difference between people who enjoy something and other people who make their entire lives about that thing? Have you ever noticed that? Like money. Who doesn't like money? We all enjoy money. But some of us make it everything in our lives. Most of us enjoy romantic relationships with a significant other. But some people make those relationships a matter of life or death. We all want to be liked by other people. But some of us have made our entire lives about winning the approval of men or women or specific groups out in the world. We all want success at the office, don't we? Yes, but some of us make our success or the lack thereof everything in our lives. The issue we're talking about today is this. We can enjoy many things, but we don't have to worship those things. We can enjoy many things in life, but there's one thing for every single one of us that becomes the thing that we worship. And that's the topic I want to address today in this next installment of the Form series, worship. What does worship mean? How does worship form us? What is worship? And if you don't have a handout because you didn't receive one for some reason, would you just lift your hand? We'll get one to you so you can fill in the blanks and have this just as a resource this morning. Just lift your hands up high, and we will get you a handout this morning as we continue the Formed series. We've been saying in this series that God has a shape or a mold or a form that He wants us to become. And the way Paul said it to the Galatians in Galatians 4:19 is that he said he was in the pains of childbirth until Christ was formed in you. That's what the image that God's going after. We said a few weeks ago that as you walk downtown, even driving in this morning, it's like there's construction everywhere, right? Everybody, like it's just everywhere. But there are oftentimes on the outside of those fences, you'll see a rendering of what it's going to look like. One of the guys who was up on the stage today, actually, not just as a great guitar player, he actually has had a lot to do with the design down at the the building next to the Transbay. And so I was just hearing him talk this morning about residents will be able to move in and when the still's going to be done. But on the outside of those fences, there's a rendering. And though you look at the infancy of the construction site, you're like, I don't know what that's going to be. The rendering allows you to see what it's becoming. Well, when it comes to who God wants you and I to be formed into, the rendering is to the image of Jesus. That is what he's after, no matter what it looks like today. That is his end game. That is what he's going for. And what I want to talk today about is how worship forms us into something, perhaps who God intended us to be, or perhaps something very different than who God intended us to be. So here's the first blank on our page. Here's Tim Keller's definition of worship. He says, worship is the act of ascribing ultimate value to something in a way that energizes and engages your whole being. He says that worship is ascribing ultimate value to something in a way that energizes and engages your whole being. And so right off the bat, what I want to tell you is this. What we're doing this morning is often what we think of as worship, but it's so much broader than that. In the previous service, my youngest son, he said, Dad, how are you feeling? I said, not great. He said, what are you teaching on today? I said, worship. He said, will you be singing songs up there? I said, no. But that's a great illustration. Worship is so much more than what we do here. Everyone worships, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But here's the deal. The world is not divided into people who worship and those who do not worship. Every single person that has ever lived and that is alive today and that is in this room, no matter what the object of your worship may be, everyone worships. Everyone worships. So when we think of it typically as this religious word, I want to expand the definition of worship for us today and say it's not just limited to what we do or what people of faith or different religions do. Worship is something that every single person does. The next blank. You are going to worship someone or something, but you were made to worship God. You're going to worship someone or something. Something's going to be most essential, most significant, what you love the most, what you value most in your life. We all have that something or someone, but we were designed, we were intended, in our wiring is this reality that we were created to worship God. That we were created to worship God, but we are worshiping something. The vision of Epic Church, which is the next thing down, and I'm not just dripping some vision to you this morning. I want you to see how our vision statement as a church, what it has to do with the concept of worship. The vision of Epic Church is to see an increasing number of people in San Francisco orient their entire lives around Jesus. Now, our church could have had hundreds, if not thousands, of different vision statements that would have been true, right? To make disciples of Jesus, to help people know and follow Jesus, to make God known and to know Him personally. I mean, we could have done a ton of different vision statements, but here's why our vision statement is we want to orient our entire lives around Jesus. It's because we believe and we know that our entire lives, everyone's life is orienting around something. Every person alive on planet Earth right now has something as most significant, as most central, as master, as ultimate value in their lives. And we believe that if people will rightly orient, center, fix their lives, build their lives around and upon Jesus, then they will be formed to become who they were created to become. Otherwise, everything's a bit skewed. So the reason we have that as our vision statement is because your life already orients around something. It already centers around something. It already has something that it sees as most ultimate and most valuable. And we're saying, to the degree to which that is Jesus, we think our lives will be rightly formed and things will be in the rightful place. But if it's something else or if it's someone else, everything gets skewed a bit. Because we all orient our lives, center our lives around something, every single one of us. And whatever that something or someone is in your life, it dictates everything else. It dictates how you make decisions. It dictates what you are willing and unwilling to do with your body. It dictates how you spend your money. It determines what you daydream about. It determines what your highest aspirations and your greatest hopes are. Whatever it is that you worship, whatever the thing is or the person is that is central. And what I want to say is that worship isn't just happening on Sunday mornings. It is happening every moment of your lives. It is happening on Monday mornings, and it is happening on Friday nights. It is happening as you interact with people. It is happening while you're at work. It is happening as you make decisions. Worship is always going on in your heart and in your life. The next blank, though, is this. We're talking about formed. This whole series is how are we being formed? And here's the next blank. We are formed by what we love most, value most, and worship most. We are formed by what we love most, what we value most, and what we worship most. Whatever it is that you love the most, value the most, worship the most, it is impacting you. You see, every single person lives for something. You can live for your favorite sports team. Anybody? You can live for the possibility of stock options. That's actually why I took this job at Epic. And with a new website and 3 gatherings, I think we're on the way up. You can live for the approval of a man or a woman or groups of people. You are living for something. And if everyone lives for something, it means that I'm living for something and that you are living for something. And whatever it is that we're living for, it is shaping us in profound ways. That's what you need to understand. And it's not the things that we say that we value most, love most, or worship most that are shaping us. It's the things that we actually love, value, and worship most that are shaping us. Does that make sense? So the songs that Brad and Brenda were leading us in this morning and that we do on a weekly basis here, saying those things, we think that can certainly be helpful, and sometimes we're just singing aspirationally, but saying those things does not mean that those are the things that are actually forming us most. It's what we actually love most. It's actually what we value most. And the crazy thing when it comes to what you value most, it can be anything. It can be having perfect kids. It can be relationships. It can be getting a promotion every year. It can be people thinking that you're a great leader. You can go on and on and on down the list, but there is something at the center of your heart and the center of your life. And the reason it's so important to distinguish and determine what that is because you need to know that whatever it is that you worship, it dictates everything else that happens in your life. Same is true for me. The same is true for every single one of us. We're being shaped in profound ways, and to the degree that we worship God, our lives will be rightly formed. But if we put something else or someone else in the place of God, our lives are going to be skewed to some degree. Now, we've been talking about this idea of worship, that it is happening all the time, that it's every day, that it's moment by moment. I've been trying to distinguish in a way that helps you know that what we're doing here isn't what worship is limited to, but I also want to talk about the significance of corporate worship. What is the significance of what we're doing here today? Is it important? Who is it for? What is it about? And here's the quote from Foster. Foster says that worship is the human response to the divine initiative. Worship is our response to God's initiative, to God revealing who He is and what He has done. And so we worship because of who God is and because of what He has done. What I want to do today is use Psalm 95 to show and to share the significance of what we're doing this morning. So if you'll follow along as I read Psalm 95, I think this psalm really gets at the heart of what corporate worship is about, why we worship God, what is the significance of being together as we worship as opposed to worshiping alone in our homes. And here's what the psalmist says. He says, "Oh, come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation. Let us come into His presence with thanksgiving. Let us make a joyful noise to Him with songs of praise. For the Lord is a great God and a great King above all gods. In His hand are the depths of the earth. The heights of the mountains are His also. The sea is His, for He made it, and His hands formed the dry land. Oh, come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord, our Maker. For He is our God, and we are the people of His pasture and the sheep of His hand. Today, if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts as at Meribah, as on the day at Massah in the wilderness, when your fathers put me to the test and put me to the proof, though they had seen my work. For 40 years I loathed that generation and said, they are a people who go astray in their heart, and they have not known my ways. Therefore I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest." an amazing psalm about the significance of corporate worship. And Tim Keller, in the next 3 blanks, he gives us 3 things that must be present in order for this worship to happen. The first thing he says is community. The first blank is community. Now, he is not saying, and I am not saying, and Psalm 95 is not saying that you and I cannot worship when we're by ourselves, that we certainly can worship God when we're alone, but there's something significant that happens when we are together. The blank from Richard Foster, just a few spaces down, he says that when we are truly gathered into worship, things occur that could never occur alone. When we are together and God is doing something among us, when we as not just individuals, but as a community, a family of faith, are setting God at the center of what we're trying to do, and God's presence is manifest among us, that's significant. Look at verses 1 and 2 and even 6 and 7 to see how many plural pronouns show up in this text so you can see the communal aspect of worship. Verse 1, let us sing to the Lord. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation. Verse 2, let us come into his presence. Let us make a joyful noise. Verse 6, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord, our Maker, for he is our God and we are the people of his pasture. Do you see the significance of this communal aspect of worship? This is what the psalmist is going like, hey, let us, we are doing this together. We're not just in our individual homes worshiping God. That's significant, but we are coming together. What we do on Sunday mornings in this space that we're in right now, we are coming together to say to one another, hey, we have a great God. Let us worship him together. So community is the first blank. The second blank is truth. The second blank is truth. If you remember what Jesus said to the woman at the well in John 4, she was trying to figure out if he was a prophet. And he said to her that the true worshipers will worship in spirit and in truth. They will worship, as Brad says, a lot of times with their heart's affections, that spirit piece, and with their mind's attention. There's that truth piece. So truth is the second blank. And here's the significance of truth when it comes to our worship. You and I cannot design a God in our mind and think that that God would be somehow worthy of our worship. One of the most dangerous things that I see and hear when it comes to people's lives who really talk a fairly big game about how they know God and all these things, oftentimes what I see is that people no longer think that God made them in his image, but somehow they have begun to make God in their image. And it's a very dangerous place. So if you go like, hey, God, if you have created a God who agrees with everything that you agree with, I'd be really careful. Nor would that God be worthy of worship. It's a figment of your own or my own imagination. So we have to be really careful with that. You see what the psalmist does with truth. Truth is a great motivator when it comes to our worship. Look at verse 3 and following. What he's doing is he's reminding the people why we should worship. He's reminding the people, here's the truth of who God is, and the reason we should worship him is because of these things. So here we go in verse 3. Here's why we should worship. Here's the truth about God. He is a great God and a great King above all gods. Verse 4, in his hand are the depths of the earth. The heights of the mountains are his also. Verse 5, the sea is his, for he made it, and his hands formed the dry land. Do you see where the psalmist is going? Here's some truth that should motivate us to worship. Does that make sense? He is a great God. He's a king above all gods. In his hand are the depths of the sea. The mountains are his. He formed the earth. He created the dry land. He should be worshiped. So we worship God because of who he is, but then we also worship God because of who he is to us. In verses 3, 4, and 5, the psalmist has listed so many of the majestic realities of God, but he hasn't involved us in a relationship capacity yet, has he? Do you see that? Why should we worship God? Well, one of the reasons in 3, 4, and 5, because of who he is, period. Who is he? He's a great God. He's a king above all gods. The sea in his hands, the mountains are his. He formed the dry land. He created the earth. But do you remember last week when we talked about this idea of prayer, and we said that the disciples asked Jesus, Lord, teach us how to pray. And the first words Jesus said, when you pray, say this, Father, what? Hallowed be thy name. Hallowed be your name. And that in that one stanza, what Jesus did, what he modeled for us, is that this great God who is holy, who's majestic, who's almighty, he has also chosen to become a father. And when you get to verse 6 and 7 of Psalm 95, he begins to do the same exact thing. He's like 3, 4, and 5. He's awesome. He's above all gods. He's above all kings. But then in verses 6 and 7, he's like, no, not only is he that kind of God, he is our God. Here's what he says in 6. Let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord, our Maker. So not only has he made the seas and the earth and the dry land and the mountains, this is the God who has uniquely created us. Verse 7, he is our God and we are his people. We're the sheep of his pasture, that God has become a shepherd to us. And so 2 reasons to worship God. A, just because of who he is. B, because of who he is to you. And so we remind ourselves of the truth. And as we remember and we think on and we feast on the truths of who God is, it leads us, it inspires us, it causes us to respond by worshiping him. Now look at verse 9. This verse really stood out to me a couple of months ago. I shared it with our staff team because I just wanted to encourage our faith. And here's what verse 9 says. It's really speaking from God's perspective. It says, when your fathers put me to the test and put me to the proof, though they had seen my work. I would just circle that phrase, though they had seen my work. Worship of God ceases in our lives when we forget the work that he's done. Let me say that again. Our worship of God, remember this component is still truth, but worship of God in our lives, it ceases to be present when we forget what he's done. And what is happening here in the text, he's saying, listen, your fathers, they put me to the test, they put me to the proof, even though they had seen my work. And as we talk about this component of truth that is a great motivator for our worship, if your worship is off, it could be that you've forgotten what you've seen. They put me to the test, they put me to the proof, though they had seen my work. They acted as if God hadn't acted. You ever been there in your life? Maybe you're in a dry spell. Maybe the answer that you want isn't coming as quickly as you want it. Does it ever come as quickly as you want it? But then you begin to think that something else is more worthy of worship, and somehow God takes a back seat because we've simply forgotten that we've seen his work. Now, maybe it's been a long time since you've experienced some of that work. Maybe you can't feel. Sometimes you just have to be able to write it down and go, God, you did this, and I will hold on to this. You are worthy of worship. You are worthy of worship. So community, truth. The third one is presence. Presence. When it comes to the word presence, I want to make a distinction for us. So there's a way in which God is always present, right? You might say the theological term would be that God is omnipresent. That is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the distinctive presence of God in a way that manifests itself as we gather together. We're talking about God's unique presence where he is center stage, where our hearts, our desires, our worship of him is just, it's ongoing, and it's ongoing because he is here and we've seen him. If you want to see what this looks like in the scriptures, go to Isaiah chapter 6. There's this moment in the temple where God reveals himself. His presence is thick, and Isaiah gets a sight of it, and he's just like, wow, this is incredible. And so we're not talking about God's awareness. We're not even talking about the fact that God is everywhere. We're talking about as we gather to worship him, we are asking that his spirit would be present. We're asking that he would manifest himself in a unique and compelling and strong way, that he would be the main event of our gathering and that we would be drawn to worship him. So community, truth, and presence. Community, truth, and presence. And I'm going to say a few things about our Sunday gatherings here at Epic. So we're about to give you a third option. Are you okay with that? Do you know that in the best case scenarios, we have 52 hours in a calendar year to gather together? Now, when you subtract the 6 weeks you spend in Hawaii for the summer, and the 4 weeks you do business in Asia, and the marathons you run for only God would know the reason, You're down to mid-30s or perhaps 40. So when you're not in town, you can't gather with us. But when you are, make it a priority. Brunch can be at another day. 52 hours a year max for us to gather together. Thousands of hours a year to do everything else. If it's important, if God does something unique with us when we gather together, I just want to encourage you and even challenge you to, when you're able to gather here with us at Epic, that you gather with us. We're giving you 3 options in the fall, so whatever your issue is, okay? If you like to sleep in, noon is for you. Good? All right, so when you can gather with us here. Foster says that if worship does not propel us into greater obedience, it has not been worship. To stand before the Holy One of eternity is to change. When we truly worship God, we are changed. When God becomes the big deal about our lives, when God becomes center stage, when God becomes the one whom we are orienting our entire lives around, we are shaped and we are molded and we are formed into the God that we're worshiping. And let me give you some personal application as we wrap up our time here. First one is this: worship God in the everyday moments of your life. Worship God in the everyday moments of your life. Just ask the question in any situation: if God is first in my life, how should I interact in this situation? How should I do business? How should I interact with this person? Where should I spend my money? What kind of decisions should I make? If God is first, how can I display that in my life moment by moment? So worship God in the everyday moments of your life. The second one, and this is a corporate thing for us here at Epic, spend some time on Saturday nights preparing your heart and praying for our Sunday gatherings. May the moment you walk in this room on a Sunday not be the first time you've thought about our gathering. I know we're busy. I know we run from one thing to the next. I know you guys have crazy Saturday night lives. But may our entrance into this room on a Sunday morning at 11 or 11:12 or 11:27, may it not be the first moment that we've thought about what we're doing on that morning. I would love for you to pray that God would move in these gatherings. I would love for you to pray that God would use those of us who are leading, whether it be the band or production team or the Epic Kids leaders or hospitality team or who's teaching for the day, whatever the case may be. Would you spend time praying that God would do something, that He would show up? So spend even a few moments of your Saturday preparing your own heart. That's first part. The second part is praying for what God would do in our Sunday gatherings. And the last thing I'll say is, do not let worship become a form of self-absorption. Do not let worship become a form of self-absorption. Now, I know you may be thinking, how would something that puts God at the center, how would that be a form of self-absorption? Well, if you've ever left a gathering like this, and I've got to admit I'm guilty, and said something to the effect of, I really didn't get anything out of worship today. Ben, you forgot that worship wasn't about you. Don't let it be a form of self-absorption. And here's what you need to know. There's a balance, a tension with this. We plan our Sunday gatherings with you in mind. So know that. We started this church because of you. Okay? Because God led us here and because of you. That's why we started this church. But let's make sure that as we gather together, that it doesn't become about us, about our preferences. Because if it did, there would not be one single volunteer in our church right now. Do you realize this? Some of you are like, oh, I'm sure the people that are back with the kids, they just love babies. Well, they probably do, but they're not serving babies because they love babies. It's part of their worship. It's part of their worship to God. Now, here's what I want to completely end with. I want to ask you this question. What in your life do you ascribe ultimate value to? And I'm not looking for the church answer, but in your life, what is the thing that it is everything? If it is good, you are good. If it is bad, you're in despair. And then whatever that thing is, I just want to ask you, what if you were to discover that there was a God who created the world, held the world in His hands, and yet made a way to be close to you at great expense to Himself? And what if this God and your relationship with Him and your worship of Him, what if it was better than any romantic relationship, more significant than any accomplishment that you could have in your life? And what if you discovered that the only way your life would work right is if He was at the center of it all? Maybe you would be like this guy at the bottom of our sheet here. Let's read this. My favorite one verse parable in the scriptures. Matthew 13:44. Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field." Have you ever discovered a treasure like that? Have you ever discovered a treasure like that? Kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. This man had finally found something to make his life about. And when he finally found what his life was to be about, he didn't care what he gave up instead. He understood something that God wants us to understand, that Jesus told the parable so that we might understand. When you experience the goodness of God, when you experience the reality that you were made to worship God, you were made to place Him at the center of your very existence and your hopes and your dreams and your future aspirations, when you understand that He is everything, then everything else gets ordered correctly. Do you remember what Jesus said in Matthew 6:33? He said, "But if you seek first the kingdom of God, then all these other things will be taken care of as well." What was He saying? He was saying first things first. If you don't get the first thing first, though, everything else gets skewed. If you get the first thing first, you get formed into the person, the man, the woman that God designed and created you to be. And so I hope that you can see as we end our time this morning that who you worship, what you worship, is forming you in profound ways. And to the degree that you find God to be the ultimate treasure, like this man did in the story, everything else will be rightly placed as well. Would you pray with me? God, I thank you that you're worthy of our worship. God, for me, for so many of us, we've lived our entire lives trying to be on this quest to find something to build our entire lives around. And God, you know what we're tempted to, every one of us in this room, whether it's success, wealth, relationships. God, so many of us just want the world to worship us. We want to make it about us. And God, I pray that you would help us see clearly that we are at our best when you're in the center of it all. God, may we be individuals, may we be a church community that really does center our lives around you, Jesus. There is no one else, there is nothing else that's worthy of us ascribing ultimate value to. So God, if there are things that we should be enjoying but we're actually worshiping, I pray that you would forgive us of that. God, if there are things that we've put in your place and look to those things to do for us what only you can do, God, I pray you would forgive us of that. But God, I do pray that you would show us your goodness. God, you would show us your magnificence. You would show us why you are worthy. And as we see the truth of who you are, God, we would be motivated to worship you. Yes, in mornings like this, but God, in moments throughout our lives, may our lives be about you. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's stand as we respond.